Hi, everybody. It's 12 o'clock somewhere, so we're going to get started. Can everybody hear me okay? Well, I'm Kathleen Murphy, and I will serve as one of the hosts for today's session. And I'm joined by my colleague and co-chair of this series, Patrice Prusco. And on behalf of the Women in STEM Cooperative, welcome to the kickoff of our original series about expanding the participation of women in STEM undergraduate education. Today's session is dedicated to higher education trends. A little bit about us. The Women in STEM Cooperative is a group of volunteers who are dedicated to advancing women in STEM in our respective communities at the University of Buffalo and Cornell University. This series is our attempt to address some of the systemic challenges and opportunities with improving STEM student success. It is the culmination of over 7 months of planning, and it has generated interest by 102 of your colleagues, represented by 46 institutions in higher education, 3 countries, 23 states, and 1 territory. Now at registration, we asked you what you hope to get out of this series, and this is what you told us. Chris, first slide, please. The word cloud.
I think that he must not have that slide.
Okay.
So we'll just keep going.
We'll share it later, but it was basically a word cloud that the words were based upon your popularity were given greater prominence, and a common theme emerged. It was, how can inclusive teaching lead to improved student learning? And at the core of our conversation is hope for a brighter future where all STEM students thrive. So over to you, Patrice.
Thanks, Kathleen. So one of our goals for this session is really to build community and give each of you a chance to share, not just with one another, but with our guest speakers, the challenges that you're having, as well as the successes. You know, what is working on your campus? What are some of the things that you're struggling with? And one of the reasons that we selected the Shindig platform was, as you can see, it gives you the opportunity to mingle and talk with other participants. But it also gives you the chance to talk directly with some of these speakers. So during, and there's the word cloud that you can see now. So during the session, you will have an opportunity to actually come up on stage if you have a camera and microphone and directly speak with our guests. If you are in a space where you can't talk out loud in a microphone, or you would just prefer to put something in as a question, you can also just type in your question and we'll bring it up on stage and read the question to you. And Chris Downs, who is a representative from Shindig, is also in the audience. So if you have any technical problems, he can help you with those. And right now we're going to show a short video that gives a tutorial on how to navigate in Shindig.
Welcome to Shindig, the video chat event provider. Click on any participant's image to engage in a private video chat. Double-click on another participant to add them to your existing conversation. Click the arrow to exit. You can also send an instant message, either to an individual or to your entire room. Want to interact with the host? Use the buttons on the lower right. Click Raise Hand to signal to the event administrator that you want to be brought on stage. Otherwise, submit a question to the host via text. If the system has not automatically detected your webcam and microphone, roll over your image and click Settings. Click your image to enable your working webcam. Choose a working microphone by selecting the option with volume indicators that flash green in response to your voice. We hope this was helpful. Enjoy the event.
So if you happen to be somebody who uses social media and you are going to have a discussion or share some things on Twitter, we do have a hashtag. It's STEM Students Thrive. So we ask you to do that. And we're excited to have 4 speakers with us here today. Our first speaker is Dr. Lynn Moulter, and she is a professor of engineering at Swarthmore College and at the Consortium for STEM Success. And from Cornell University, we have Dr. Julia Tom-Levy, who is an associate professor of physics and is our new vice provost for academic innovation. And at the University of Buffalo, we have Dr. Elizabeth Atopio, who is Interim Assistant Dean for Teacher Education, Interim Director of the Teacher Education Institute, and Program Director of Music Education. And we have Dr. Richard Lamb, who is Associate Professor and Director of the Neurocognition Science Laboratory. And one of the things that we would like each of you to do in the chat area is to please share what institution you're from, maybe where you are located, as well as your role, and if you'd like a challenge or a topic that you would be interested in discussing. And now I will turn it over to Kathleen, who will start us off with Dr. Lynn Moltner.
Hi, Lynn. Before we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're up to at Swarthmore?
Well, I've been teaching here for now 30 years. I teach engineering, predominantly electrical, but we are a general engineering program, and we have about 30% women on average in our program. And we are working very hard to find ways to increase our numbers of women and underrepresented minorities, and in every regard that we possibly can.
Okay, well, I don't want to take time away from you, so let's get right into your presentation.
Great.
Chris is going to bring it up.
So the project I'm going to talk to you about is called the Customs Project, Consortium for Undergraduate STEM Success. The underlines don't show very well, but that's what Customs stands for, so we can move on. So I'll give you a little bit of information about the project itself first, and then talk about the data that we collected, and move on to how we analyzed it and some conclusions and observations. Next slide. So the project was 25 to 35 institutions, depending on when you counted. It included public universities, including a good number of HBCUs through the Thurgood Marshall group, to which all of the public HBCUs belong. We also had private universities and liberal arts colleges. There was a 2-year pilot and then the 4-year project itself. And Ted Greenwood of the Sloan Foundation was our mentor and supporter. And the short goal of the project was to try to figure out what we could use to predict who needs what kinds of resources, which students need which kinds of resources to be successful. And we wanted to know that sort of generally across the boards, but also down to each school, because each school, of course, is a little different. And one other question that we wanted to be able to answer is, if you are an administrator, where would you want to put resources to help retain students better? So we collected data files that were quite extensive, three different kinds. One at the beginning for admissions, one every year called academic data files, and then one at graduation. And we administered a survey at the beginning and the end. And we analyzed the data separately, but then we also linked it and tried to answer some questions. I obviously don't have time to go into much of all of that, but I'll just give you a few examples. Next slide. So in the data files, we had, this is not even a complete list, but again, examples of what we collected from institutions. So you can see that it's a very monumental task for the institutions to provide this information, but for those who can, it was really informative. And also, I will say that setting it up was difficult, but once an institution did have it set up, then it was much easier for them to do it going forward. So I won't read all these to you, but you can see the kinds of things that we have in our data files. And so we ended up with quite a bit of data. We had obviously tens of thousands of individual records. And so that just gives you a sense of how many students were involved. So next slide. All right, so we created something we called migration charts, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but migration means, where did you start when you anticipated your major in college? Was it a STEM major or not? And where did you graduate? What did you graduate with? So we broke these, we did many of these, broke them down in every different way, not every, but many different ways. And so I'll just show you one slide, and then if people have questions, I'm happy to look at others. So this is all students who said they wanted to start, when they started, wanted to do a STEM major, and then they also did a STEM major. And so you can see that the total in the first set of bars, and the start and end was not very different. However, if you look, when you break it down, it can be somewhat different, but in fact it was less different overall in this large data set than we thought. So one lesson that we learned from all of this is that the data had to be disaggregated. A lot of effects sort of canceled each other out if you just kept the giant data set as it was. So that was something we didn't really exactly anticipate. So if we could jump to the end of these, because I have a bunch of them in case anybody wants to ask a question. And once they don't look like bar graphs, I'm ready to, here we go. So here's another way that we use to visualize it. This is very qualitative. They're called Sankey diagrams. And you have a starting population and a population that starts with a certain major, and then we have a graphic that shows where they end. So we can look at one of these. So it looks very busy, but you can see the students that migrate. For example, engineering is on the top. So the students who wanted to do engineering and did is a fairly large percentage, but then you can see them migrating out on the left-hand side at the bottom of the green bar, and you can see where they went in these diagrams. So that's men. We again did many of these. Maybe just one more of these to see women. The next one, I think, is all women. And you can see a smaller number of women doing engineering. You can see, in fact, a larger percentage migrating out compared to men. And we did it for underrepresented minorities as well. So we can probably move on then to, yeah. So again, we were a little bit surprised about the net migration out of STEM is small. And part of the reason that it looks so small is that more students migrated in than we anticipated. And that may be sort of because of computer science having so many students, and I'm sure there are other reasons. But engineering does have a larger net migration out than some of the other sciences, and some of the sciences actually have migrations in. But again, women and underrepresented minorities, as well as low socioeconomic, first generation, etc., all the people that we know do have a net migration out. So one more slide of this. But some areas had gains, and but some of them, in fact, where the gains were smaller enrollments. So one student could make a big difference, or not one student, but a few students could make a larger difference. And future work, we did not include students who left college. We didn't have a way to track them, but that would be an interesting question, we thought. Okay, so we can move on. So this is one of my favorite slides, talking about whether students continue after a gateway course. And I apologize, the background noise has just gotten louder. They're doing construction outside my window. So let me know if you can't hear. So we can go to that picture, that graphic. And so the vertical axis is the percentage of students retained in the major, and the horizontal axis is the grade in a first gateway course. We also did this for average grade in the major, et cetera, et cetera. So you would expect lines to have a positive slope here. So if a student has a lower grade, they would be less likely to be retained, and vice versa. And you can see that math has that positive slope, but if you look at physics, it doesn't in this particular set of students. So women were getting better grades, but being retained less well. And so there must be reasons behind that. Okay, so decision trees. I don't know if you've heard of these. They're often, you see them during presidential elections and a lot of other places. So what it is a software or a program that identifies the relevant factors for staying or leaving STEM disciplines. So I'm going to try to talk this through, but I'm not going to be able to do it justice in the time that we have, but maybe let's just try it. So the top box says math score, and that means on the SAT or ACT. So that turned out to be the most important thing for this set of students. And if their score was high, you go to the right, and then the next most important factor for being retained was their GPA. If their GPA was medium or high, 2/3 roughly stayed. If it was low, about 44% stayed, so less than half. Whereas if you go to the people who scored lower on the math SAT, a low or medium, then if it was low, they don't stay very well. Only about 1/3 stay. And if it was medium, then you have some other factors that were still important. You set a threshold, and it goes as far until you hit that threshold. So then gender was the next most important thing, et cetera, et cetera. So you can get a prediction for staying or leaving based on characteristics of the group that you belong to, or of what data we have about the student. And so we ran a lot of these. Next slide, please. We don't have to do 2 of them. That's fine. Okay, so finally, Bayesian network. So you can move on to the next slide. I can't go through again. I can just tell you the results of a simple example. The Let's Make a Deal with Money Hall and 3 doors. So on that show, the contestant would choose a door. Obviously, the chances are 1/3 that you got the door with the car versus the goat. But they don't open it. And then Monty Hall used to sometimes open one of the other 2 doors and ask, would you like to change your mind? And excuse me. And the initial thing that many people think is that it's 50-50 between the other 2 doors, and it doesn't help to change. It's not a clear choice. So, have the next slide, please. But it turns out that, in fact, you increase your chances of winning to about 2/3 if you do switch your slide. So, if anybody's interested in this, I have some links that explain it using Bayes' theorem. So, what did we find in our work? Next slide, please. So we found out that there were a number. So I guess the main thing we're trying to figure out is what causes what. What we know all of these categories. If you are a woman, you're less likely to be retained. If you have, if your parents do not have college education, you're less likely to be retained, et cetera, et cetera. So, but the question is, what causes what? And so, while these factors are all correct and they do influence the outcome, we found a really interesting, our interesting finding was that the math, actually this one just says math score, but in fact, your placement in a math course is the most important factor, and other things feed into that. So, for example, if you're a woman, you might be a little less likely to be placed into the right math course. And when I say the right math course, it depends if you are successful in your first math course. It doesn't matter if you're placed into trigonometry or multivariable calculus. If you get an A in it, you're more likely to succeed, regardless of what level you are. Which made me really happy because I feel like that's something we could do something about. It's also a less charged issue, so it's kind of, that I was very happy with that result. Next slide, please. So this is sort of a description of what I said very quickly, that certainly all of these factors are relevant, but they feed into what happens with math, with what's going to happen with math. Okay, next slide. And again, talking about what we might be able to do about that, and hoping that that is something that we could address with resources, obviously, and time, but that it's something that we hope we could use to inform our future work. And just to note, then we went back and looked at the other analyses that we had, and we can see that these are all consistent together. It's just that the other analyses came up with the set of factors that are important, but they didn't come up with causality, but it's still all consistent. Everything sort of does relate to math, and anecdotally myself, I feel like that's an issue too. I don't look at what students so much did in physics in high school. Physics programs are so non-equivalent in various places. Some are great, some are not. Whereas math is more standardized, I feel like, and so that is something that we focus on in that way. So I just want to thank the following people and groups, and they've all been involved in some way. We're currently working with the Business and Higher Education Forum, and we recently did a study for the National Academy of Sciences on computer science students because of the growing, very large enrollments, to try to determine who is coming into that discipline, who's staying, who's leaving. And I guess I'll close there and see if there are questions.
So, Chris, can you help us out? Where would the questions appear? So please ask your questions. We got time for 1 or 2 questions with Lynn.
Hi, Lynn. Thanks so much for a great conversation. And it looks like we have a question. Can you see that okay, Kathleen?
Yes, I can see it. CUSTOM stands for Consortium for Undergraduate STEM Success.
So, Lynn, while we're waiting for other people in the audience to ask a question, I was wondering if you looked at how outside the classroom experiences might have also impacted that, and the background that the students came from with respect to the success they had in those early math classes.
Oh yes, we have those results would have come because we have the survey results that we also have connected with the data, the quantitative data. So those results again vary very significantly among disciplines, among schools. But I think it's a really important question that each school and department may want to ask. And I can give you one example. Here we find that it's really important to have academic support available in our department with our upper level students in the evening. We have a staff member who oversees that. And they're also here, we have them a nice living room with the kitchen and whatever, and they bond together. And having the class bond together is a very important aspect. It's great. It's important, very important to have people who you identify with and who look like you and who seem like you, but you can also establish relationships with others. And if you can facilitate that, I know teaching and learning centers have also their advantages, but for us, it's really important to keep our students near us, the faculty, as well as each other for the 4 class years.
Thank you. And it looks like we have a question from the audience. Chris is going to be bringing up that. It's a text question now.
Can you see that, Lynn?
Yes. T is for technology. If a student leaves engineering discipline, okay, so yes, that's a really good question. That is, we spend a lot of time determining what we call STEM disciplines, because some of them are now obviously interdisciplinary, neuroscience or whatever. And so how we handled that is we asked each institution to tell us what was STEM in their school. So sometimes there was a discipline that at one school was a STEM discipline and in another school it wasn't. So we trusted people to say for our data analysis. Now, obviously, we were looking at zip codes, CIP codes, not zip codes, that are the way that people identify different disciplines, and they have two-digit that are very broad, and they go down to 6-digit that are very specific, and there are a lot of them. So we used that as our starting point, but then we asked our participants to tell us what they're doing, because obviously we don't know. You can say that's not a very good way to do it, and I wouldn't be able to defend it hugely, but that's what we decided to do.
Okay, well, let's save the remaining questions until later.
It looks like Lisa's up on stage. I think you want to ask a question, Lisa?
I was just curious. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm often confused by the definition of the disciplines that fall into STEM. I mean, I get all of them except the T. So for example, if a student comes to an engineering curriculum and decides that he or she wants to go into something like computer graphics or broadcast technology, does that still count as T? Is there a definitive list that fits the T?
Well, the zip codes do have a definitive list of under each code, but they don't say which ones are STEM and which ones are not exactly. So you can get some sense of it from the branches that it came from. So you start at the highest level, and there are 2-digit zip codes. So those, I can't offhand, like, I think psychology might be one of them. That doesn't really tell you if under psychology which ones are going to be, because social psychology might not be as sciencey as something neuro or cognitive or whatever. So again, yeah, that's a really good question, and we struggled a lot with trying to determine what exactly is and is not. Even with technology is a hard one, but even with some of the others. You're right, and I'm sorry I don't have a good answer besides agreeing amongst the group and saying what it is that you did when you do it.
Yeah, I'm not sure there is a good answer. I'd be curious, because even the neurocognition people use, the fMRI helmets and lots of technology. Technology is an enabler, but not technology as a field per se. So yeah, I'll be interested to hear more.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that, Lisa. I think that's a really important question as we think about how to help students develop a STEM identity.
I agree.
All right. Well, thank you, Lynn. If you want to hang out till the end in case there's some additional questions, we'd appreciate it. But now we need to introduce our next speaker. Go ahead, Patrice.
So next we have Dr. Julia Tom-Levy joining us. So I think Chris will be bringing Julia up on stage. Hi, Julia. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. Just to start, I thought it might be of interest to people if you want to share a little bit about your new role as the Vice Provost of Academic Innovation and some of the projects and things that we're thinking about working on.
Sure. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm a physics professor. I've been here at Cornell for 12 years now. And last year I started working I got involved in teaching and active learning in an initiative in the Arts and Science College I'll talk about in a minute. And it made me become very interested in teaching and the effects it has on certain student populations. Things I had not really been aware of before until we started experimenting, looking at data, trying different pedagogies. And then last year, I became a provost fellow for pedagogical innovation, just looking at active learning across the university and the role of technology, educational technology, and I've recently become a vice provost. So it's interesting. I come from a very specific physics context and now branching out, what does this mean for undergraduate education across a big decentralized university?
Yeah. And so when we first met, that was one of the very first conversations we had, was your experience incorporating active learning into the classroom. And so I was wondering if you could just take a minute to reflect back to when you were first asked to participate in that initiative. What your initial thoughts were about participating, and what was the support you needed to successfully experiment and implement it?
Yeah, good question. So when I was asked to participate, I had tenure, but I was, as many people, completely deeply into research. Research was the big, thing that mattered. And I was teaching big undergraduate classes, but sort of in the same way that I had been taught. So lecture style, I walk in there with the white knuckles holding my lecture notes and then reading them to a class of 300. I had sort of peripherally seen some of the work that Carl Wyman has been doing, and Eric Mazur and many other physicists about active learning, flipping the classroom, student engagement, and so on. So I'm a fairly new to this discussion, only for 5 or 6 years now. And what was the enabler for me is that 6 faculty joined this initiative, that the dean and the chair were actively involved, endorsing this and participating themselves in it. So it seemed okay. Colleagues were doing this and were excited to learn something new. So, and also I'd been teaching large undergraduate STEM courses for years, and I knew something wasn't right. And, I know from my own experience, the thing we all know is that the women are leaving disproportionately. We have a pipeline problem, always the feeling of not belonging, of this is somehow not for me, and so on, that we all are aware of. So it was maybe fertile ground for me to try and address this and try and see if a different teaching style would make a difference. So this was an initiative started in the College of Arts and Science. It's interesting because it was a donor who had given money quite a bit. By now it's expanded. Originally it was just pitched to STEM. Now it's expanded into the humanities. And we have, let me just look at we initially awards were given to 2 departments, and now we've just awarded 7 more this year. And so far, it's been a commitment of $5 million. So it's a significant financial commitment for undergraduate teaching. And I can tell you how the money was spent and why, what the resources were and what was important about it. So the 2 STEM departments that participated initially were physics and biology, and we now have some data. That was the other interesting thing that I learned about assessment and, learning analytics and developing awareness of what kind of questions you can ask. And we're starting to ask questions about belonging, level of comfort, level of confidence, and how that correlates with grades and so on. Okay, so by now we have 70 faculty involved, all ages and career stages. So that's interesting. It's a significant piece of the sort of overall faculty in arts and science.
So was there one thing that surprised you about the experience? Something maybe an unexpected result?
Right. I mean, everything was unexpected. So it was very scary. We had these teams of 2 faculty who would work together to flip their class. So what that means was putting the lecture material, making it into student problems that they could attack in small groups during class. And so we assemble people into small groups. This is all very well known, blocked off rows. And then instead of lecturing or all the time lecturing, they would prepare before class, do a little quiz, come in, work in groups, and I would hover with the TAs and walk and meet as many of them as possible and talk all through the lectures. Sometimes I would stop and then go into to the front and do a mini 5-minute lecture. They're now very invested. They've worked on something. Maybe 80% of the room is confused about, I don't know, angular momentum or something. And so now I do an improvised mini lecture, just 3 minutes, and they, it would be absolutely quiet, people paying attention, really invested. We used a lot of demos, just a lot of discussion. It was just an unbelievable experience. So I remember I was very scared before implementing this because it's completely new. I thought they wouldn't prepare, they wouldn't be able to work together, the whole thing would flop. I wouldn't be able to, bring the content into the classroom. And then, I still remember the very first lesson. We just started this, and the whole classroom, all 300 of them, are totally engaged. It's loud, everybody's talking about the question. When up until then, I'd only taught in quiet lecture halls with, the last 10 rows all asleep. So that was, and I learned so much that semester. I learned so much about the students, things they were confused about, got to know them personally, they knew me. They were much more likely to come talk to me, as always talking to students, always, interacting, and always changing the lecture material because I now knew what they were confused about. So it's an unbelievable, I'll never go back. This is really transformative for me. It made me really interested in how students learn and what they think about physics. And then the first results came in. The exams went very much better. So we had matched final and prelim exams. So we had almost 1 letter grade improvement for everybody. We then started to look per student population, and also comparing with biology, did something similar. And the one really powerful thing we're seeing is that underrepresented students, it could be women or underrepresented minority or underserved students, are doing, feeling more confident, feeling a greater sense of belonging, and it correlates with the grades. So for example, achievement gaps are closing. We see that in biology. And this data is that's very, very powerful.
So you mentioned their confidence was increasing, as well as their sense of belonging, which we all know are really important. Do you have a sense of what it is about active learning that, may be contributing to that?
It's interesting. We changed so much at once that I could never quite tell what it was. Was it the the engagement with the material before class? So people come in more prepared, and so there's no more cramming for exams. They're always working on the material. Was that a big contributor? My own sense that the belonging and so on, that changed, is that you are in small groups and you're always engaging. You're always talking to somebody. You're always explaining or learning from your peers. You are engaging with the coaches, so with the faculty or the TAs who are floating around and talking to people. So it's much more, you belong to a group that's working on a problem. And, that was certainly my sort of anecdotal evidence, and just the number of students who came to me, and my own perception that they were predominantly women and underrepresented minority students who, before not talk to me in the same way. They now, and it might also be the engagement with on the individual level, that they felt more comfortable to come and talk.
So now that you've got everyone excited about incorporating active learning into their classroom, I think especially you mentioned that you had 300 students in your class. I think that it's daunting for people to think about, how would I get started? How would I manage this? Are there 1 or 2 pieces of advice you could give, to some of the participants here about how to get started?
It's very hard. So in physics, it's not actually, there's a lot of material. Lots of people have worked on this. So there are good questions that are very suitable for this kind of teaching out there in textbooks and so on that can be used. It's harder in other fields, I think, because this is not a pedagogy that's used as much in other fields sometimes. So what was really what was really important for me was to have a semester off to flip my classroom, to really prepare with somebody who had read some of the literature, because I sure had no time to read, education papers and so on. And so it was all new to me, but I was working with somebody who thought about the dedicated teacher, lecturer in the physics department, and who was keeping track of the literature. And I had a semester without teaching, which is a total luxury. I mean, I don't think I could have done this without that semester off. Once you have the materials lined up, as we all know, it gets much, much easier in the following semesters. So money to get people to get somebody out of teaching. Other departments have worked with teaching postdocs, also total luxury, and was again afforded by this donor money. Somebody who is trained and can help you, flip your materials in this way. That was very powerful. And then, one big question we're wrestling with. So now I've done 5 years of this big course. Now I'm, cycling into a graduate class or something like that. How will this work should not go away, right? So ownership and departmental investment and institutionalizing this new pedagogy, now that it's been shown year after year after year to have much better results and to have much more thriving students and higher retention. How does the next instructor take on this and doesn't throw it all out the window and starts from scratch, but how do you do a handoff? So getting somebody into the class who has some overlap with me, and then we do a handoff is very important too. But it's not easy. So one piece of advice, if those resources are not available, which they seldom are, is to just do a couple of small things and to see that even small changes of even having one, many people are already doing this, of course, but having one small problem for people to work on in lecture actively and talk to their peers, or to do, think, pair, share sort of things in class. So there are many small things one can do. Very, very powerful for me were iClickers. That was the first time I got feedback from 300 students telling me that I can't move on. They have not understood. I've not explained it correctly. I've not, we've not digested this piece. It doesn't make sense. I'll move on at this point. This is very, very sobering, very interesting. So I'm interested in all of the above. Research, undergraduate research is a great example of drawing in students and linking that with the content in the classroom, if possible. So I think there's a whole host of things we can do that matter, and I think that's what we remember. Where was the inspiration? Where did the learning really take place? Right? It was when it became relevant. And it also had something to do with joy and and a human connection. I think that's sometimes lost a little bit, and it's very difficult for certain students to sort of, if that's lost, that often turns off people.
Great. And I love that you brought up joy. That's the best part. Yeah. So I think our discussion time is about up. Chris, do we have any questions? One or two questions from the audience? Remember, you can raise your hand if you want to come up on stage, or you can click on the question bubble if there's a text question that you want to ask. Okay, and I guess there's no questions just yet. So I think what we'll do is bring Elizabeth and Richard up on stage next, and then Julie, if you have time, a little bit more time to stick around, there might be some questions at the end when we're done. So Thanks for a really great conversation.
Thanks for organizing. Very cool format.
Julia's back. I guess we have two questions, Julia. So why don't we do those two questions now before we bring Richard and Beth up, since you have to leave a little bit early.
Yes, that's a great question.
Okay. So our first question is there an instructional design team or Center for Teaching Excellence that helps you?
Funny you ask. I forgot to talk about that. That's, of course, a really important part of it. In this, what kind of scaffolding does a busy faculty member need to really do this kind of work? And I talked about somebody specifically in physics who was helping. But yes, so we do have a Center for Teaching Innovation, and I oversee that center now in my new role. And we've just done a very interesting merger where we brought the technology team together with the more traditional, faculty development in the area of pedagogy and inclusive classroom and assessment to form a bigger team that can, provide now support for a faculty member in a variety of arenas. So I think that's very powerful. And that is used by many faculty members. So my own situation was a little bit different, although I did, ask for help specifically on our learning management system from staff members. So, for example, how to include quizzes so that I could test the pre-reading and things like that. So yes, we do have that, and we have great plans for, that's the support team that will help more faculty across the university try out things like that. And so I think it's very powerful to have, an interdisciplinary support team that can help both with technology and with, for example, putting an assessment plan in place and then helping analyze the data. Yes, great question.
Okay, and then we have one more question. How long did it take for students to switch to preparing properly before the class sessions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this was initially the biggest hoopla in the classroom. The students were very disturbed by this. And I get it. I mean, it was adding more time that they were spending than they already, it's a 4-credit class. And they were not happy about this. And we very carefully made sure that then the homework was shorter or taking away time so they, that the overall time commitment would not be bigger. They caught on to this right away. They read the 3 chapters and, answered 10 questions and did very well with that. I think this may not work with an upper class classroom. I think these were freshmen at Cornell, very high achieving, overachieving students, and they were on this right away. It's one of the things I thought wouldn't work, but they did this from day one, and even for a little bit of credit, prepared and did the quiz, and were one of the most powerful ingredients in my lecture would be to have access to the outcomes from the pre-lecture quiz, and the one question that 50% got wrong, or they needed 3 tries to get to the right answer. So I'd start with that and lead with that. And they were very, very invested, very interested to hear what was the right question and what was the right answer and why. So it worked surprisingly well. And it might just be because they were freshmen. And I made, one very important thing that our dean actually told me to do is talk to them about the pedagogy, talk to them why you're doing this, talk to them how you're thinking about it, ask for their input, react to their input. So that was also a new experience to me. And it was a lot of work, because there are a lot of them, but it really helped me, then tweak things and, consider their input and respond to it and get into a conversation about how should we structure this class so that you guys can learn optimally and learn, with your long-term memory and, not have to cram for the exams, which you'll then all forget afterwards. And so we had these conversations, which is very surprisingly powerful. Yeah. Sorry, long answer to a short question.
All right, thank you. And I think there's 2 other questions, but we'll save them for the end. And if you have to leave before we get to them, we can follow up with you on them.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And now we'll bring Richard and Beth up. Hi. Thanks so much for joining us from Buffalo. How's the weather there today?
A little cloudy, a little rainy, but it'll get better. We have faith.
Okay. So you'll start with your presentation. I think you have a short video, and then we'll move to Q&A. But I wanted to remind the audience that you can raise your hand to come up on stage or put something in the text box at any time during the presentation. So don't feel like you have to wait until the end, because we would love to just have an interactive conversation with you.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity today to talk a little bit about our work in virtual reality and its applications to higher education. Our hope is just to briefly provide a bit of context for our work, share where we are in our project, and then provide lots of time for that interaction and questions and implications for how virtual reality might be used as an effective tool for women and other underrepresented minorities in our STEM classes in higher ed. Chris, you can go on to the next slide, please.
So there's quite a few areas where we start to think about student learning, and particularly in the STEM discipline, in the incorporation of computer and educational technologies. So beyond all of that, to support student learning, one of the big things that we find is really important, particularly in the STEM disciplines, as we look at from the middle school through the upper grades, is these what we call authentic experiences. And virtual reality and educational technology offer some really important ways to look at these authentic experiences. And virtual reality, as you can see, offers sense of immersion, fluidity, and authenticity to the overall experience of what we're doing in the educational environment. Next slide, please.
So while this increased focus is good, and oftentimes technological tools such as VR and other hands-on strategies, they're implemented in ways that may not necessarily be effective in increasing student learning. The tool, whether VR or other educational technology and/or experiential activities, they must match the desired learning outcomes. So the assumption of hands-on being better is suspect when it is not coupled with the appropriate types of pedagogical support.
And to put this more into a kind of perspective a little bit, you know, if I'm asking you to repair something like an air conditioner, I can't just hand you a bunch of the tools and say, okay, this is a hands-on experience, go and fix the air conditioner. There has to be a lot of structure around the work and around the pieces associated with fixing that air conditioner so that the student, the novice, can move through the different phases from novice to expert. So if you're not providing that structure, it doesn't matter whether it's hands-on or virtual reality, you're going to run into trouble.
So how are we structuring this, and how are we matching the use of virtual reality to learning outcomes in teacher ed? I had a problem because my students were being placed in field settings and were not necessarily prepared as well as they could be for the realities of teaching. In teacher ed, we have long been documenting the need for immersive clinical experiences and providing these in authentic contexts. At the same time, it has become increasingly more difficult for us to place students in schools with mentor teachers to facilitate these experiences. So Rich and I had a series of conversations where we talked about how virtual reality classroom environments might serve the same role as flight simulators for pilots. The idea was that perhaps we could provide an experience for students where they can practice basic pedagogical skills in a soft failure environment. Our hope was that engagement in the VR would lead to automaticity of a number of skills needed for effective teaching. Next slide. Our initial project was funded by a SUNY IITG grant, and it was to develop a proof of concept that this work could indeed be done. Rich and I reviewed a number of high leverage practices associated with teaching and selected a couple of these to be explored during this prototype stage. The next step was to develop and record the scenarios with a high definition camera. And that work is being finalized now, and we are beginning to use it with students in our teacher education cohorts. The students who have had the experience with the tool are giving us initially good feedback, and that will inform our further work. One of our candidates said, "I enjoyed being a fly on the wall in a real urban school." The students actually felt real. So we're finding that the immersiveness of the experience seems to be one of the most promising aspects of the project thus far. I was initially skeptical, wondering how what we were doing was different from watching a regular 2D video or engaging in other types of experiential activities. But overwhelmingly, those that have tried the VR say that there is something about putting on the glasses and shutting out all the other distractions that make the scenarios feel real. In fact, the preliminary psychophysiological data is suggesting that responses in the VR are similar to that of being in a real classroom. Next slide.
Okay. So what we're looking at here is just kind of, and you probably all have heard this, is the leaky STEM pipeline. And so we start to look at it back almost at 5th and 6th grade. And we look at those as the pool of future STEM higher education students. They kind of go through this process we call K-12 education. They get to the higher ed level, and we lose a lot of students along the way. So before we even get to the students who are in the engineering classes or into the chemistry classes or whatever classes, the mathematics classes, we've already lost a large number of those students. And so you end up with a much smaller group of actual STEM majors or STEM discipline content students. And this doesn't arise, so in K-12 education, we talk about the idea of the achievement gap. There's this gap in achievement between this group and that group. Well, we don't conceptualize it that way anymore because we don't believe that it's an issue with someone's ability to achieve. What we actually see it is what we call an opportunity gap. And it's the opportunities that are presented to the students, and those opportunities are most often presented by teachers at the K-12 and even including the higher ed level. So as we're presenting these opportunities to the students to learn, we want to do what's called close the opportunity gap, and virtual reality and educational technologies provide a great way to do that.
Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
So we find that this opportunity gap is actually increased when we begin looking at underrepresented populations. And we are beginning to look at underrepresented as more than just gender and race. It's really the intersection of gender, race, and poverty. And so next slide. So our model here is where we think that VR, you can see the little camera up in the top, and our project is actually going to help us prepare teachers who are better able to interface with the opportunity gap in a meaningful way. And those teachers are the ones who are going to be working with those students in elementary schools and in middle schools, preparing them for high school, preparing them for our institutional higher ed classes in the STEM disciplines. Okay, so our next steps are to expand our proof of concept and to scale this. We're interested in creating additional VR content that's related to high leverage practices, not only for pre-K to 12th grade, but also in higher ed settings. And then the other thing that we're finding is that it's important to build structures around the technological tools in order to make them successful. And so sometimes we see VR or something new as a shiny penny, and then we hand the VR to the professor and say, go do great things. But we don't necessarily build the educational structure around that. So we're also paying attention to those pieces that will support the actual product that is in the process of being created.
So the question becomes, kind of what does VR look like? So we pulled together some video that just illustrates what we see and how the learning can impact, in this case, younger students, but in general, the impacts are very similar when across different age bands. So Chris, I don't know if you can get the video up or not.
My area of interest is actually the science of learning. The lab is called the Neurocognition Science Laboratory, and it's new to UB, but it's also new to the broader field of education. I use physiological measures, things like functional near-infrared spectroscopy, electroencephalography, tools to look at the brain and how the brain changes as someone learns.
So these are the goggles. Where do you think we're gonna wear these?
If you're familiar with video games and the Xbox and things like that, you typically play it on a flat computer screen, and it may have an environment in which you can maneuver in three dimensions, but it's all still flat on the screen.
What do you see? Tell us.
Fishy.
Virtual reality is the actual immersion of the person into those three-dimensional environments in such a way as that the environment is continuous around them.
Look up again. I think there's
A sea turtle!
And then later on in the lessons, the teachers, the daycare teachers, were explaining that they were able to refer back to what they had seen in the reef in the virtual reality. I mean, that's powerful.
And I love being underwater.
Things I think that's really important to point out in that is the level of engagement you saw with the little ones there is actually the same level and behaviors that we have adults engage in when they're in the virtual reality. So they're running around swatting at the sea turtles and the sea anemones and everything like that. They're asking questions. And I've had adults come back to the lab and talk about how they remember particular things. I mean, so there's a lot of opportunity for engagement and a lot of opportunity for adults and kids to see things and do things that they wouldn't otherwise have the opportunity to engage with. So for example, if we're looking at visiting the Smithsonian. We have a school here in Buffalo. The students will probably never have the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. and see the monuments. So if we can't have that happen, let's bring the monuments to them. So it's the same idea. And as we build both these opportunity and experiential components, thinking about our pre-service teachers, thinking about women in STEM, thinking about all the different aspects of what we can do with virtual reality, I think there's a huge opportunity for everyone to be able to provide some experience and leverage some high output pedagogies with that.
All right, so what we wanted to do now is throw out the opportunity to have discussion with you in the audience and participants about questions that you might have regarding our project or any of these questions that's up on the screen.
Excuse me.
So thank you both. That was really interesting. And I think it really tied together nicely a lot of what Julia and Lynn talked about, the importance of those early math experiences and really focusing on that. And you did mention, which I really appreciated as an instructional designer, you mentioned the importance of not just handing off the shiny object to instructors, but really scaffolding them, helping them think about, what is the pedagogical intent of this tool. So I think those are really, really great points. And we do have one question already, so why don't we go over to that?
Okay, so right now, I will mention that the VR was created in a classroom in a predominantly poor neighborhood in the city of Buffalo with children of color. But we're not necessarily testing it in that environment, although Rich, you've done work with students in there with the VR. What we're doing is training the teachers to be better pedagogues and more effective in dealing with that opportunity gap and that intersection of poverty and its impacts on learning. And so we need better teachers who are better prepared in those environments.
Thank you. And a question that I'd like to pose that I suspect many people might be wondering about, and it's a discussion that we've had in our own group, is the perception is virtual reality is really expensive to start an initiative on your campus. And I know that you had the grant from SUNY. How might somebody who maybe doesn't have a grant get started using VR? Like, are there some suggestions that you have?
There are some low-cost ways to start. You can start with everything from Google Cardboard to even Facebook and YouTube support three-dimensional video, which I recognize is not exactly the same as virtual reality, but there are kind of incremental steps along the way that you can make use of if you're interested in trying this. And even with on the flat screen with the three-dimensional camera, you're still getting some of the affordances associated with the virtual reality, the immersive environment and those types of things. Now, I would argue it's not quite as good, but there are kind of inexpensive ways. One of the intents we have in this project and working with our pre-service teachers is to make it a situation where they can actually download it to their phone, put it into a Google Cardboard and work with it kind of on their own time whenever they would like. So taking the idea of the flipped classroom, but then providing them additional practice in that soft failure environment. Did that answer your question?
Yes, yeah. And going back to some of the, you mentioned developing resources and things to help faculty. Is there anywhere that people could go to look at a report or resources that you use that they might reference as a way to get started?
So the short answer is not yet. We would be happy to, if someone were to email either one of us, we'd be happy to work with them to supply them with the resources we have and ideas around that. As we develop the prototype, so we're still in a prototype stage with the work we're doing, but as we develop that prototype, we'll be happy to share. And like I said, we're always willing to take on collaborators and people who are truly interested in exploring this with us.
Okay. And thinking about undergraduate education, a lot of what we do at Cornell and other universities is work with postdocs and TAs and helping them think about how to, their approach to STEM education. Are there ways that your focus seemed to be on pre-service teachers, but are there ways that you might imagine it being used at that level?
Okay, so I think there are several ways. And one of the things that I would argue is good teaching is good teaching. And I understand that there's content differences, certainly. If you're, a professor of engineering, you need to be an expert in engineering, whereas an elementary teacher has expertise in a different area. But the underlying pedagogies that I think you make use of in the ways that you do that, and always thinking about student learning and why, it shouldn't be we're doing this to the student. The student we should always be thinking, how do we support the student in the learning? And so the pedagogies that derive from, whether it's working with an elementary teacher or working with the engineering professor over here, in a lot of ways are the same. That's why we have this separation in educational practice between pedagogy and content. We would certainly never argue we're experts in medicine or engineering, but we are experts in pedagogy. And so really understanding how those pieces work together.
Okay, thank you. And I think that we have about 15 minutes left, and I know that Julia has to leave a little bit early, and there was one question for her. So if she has time, why don't we go to that question? So do you have time just for one question, Julia?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so Chris, okay, here you go. Were students assigned, or did they form their own groups, and were there any students left out, and how did you deal with that?
Really good question. So I started out by just letting people assemble into groups. I didn't even anticipate the effect. And then during the semester, I observed that some students would be on their own, and then talking to them, sometimes getting the answer, I just learned better by myself, or I didn't like my group, or these were the people I knew and they're not here today, or something like that. And suspecting that there's an element of not feeling included or not belonging to the people who are just around them. And so we did experiment with assigning groups. So a colleague of mine would intentionally engineer these little small learning groups, and you can do that. So, and then he would, for every single class, reassemble them. So we did several experiments, just assembling the same mini group, and then mixing it every time. And we've had quite good results doing that. But I've also observed that the students who do assemble into groups are sometimes happy. They learn well with their friends or people they're comfortable with. But the problem, of course, is that some students are left out. So we've done both, and it's a really good question, and I think has been studied also. Where do students best interact? We kept it very, a lecture would move very quickly through many different, it wouldn't ever be more than 5 or maybe 7 minutes of the same teaching, the same activity. So you could quickly reassemble people and do something else and bring everybody together and now, talk to 3 other people or something like that. And I think that has worked well. So that it's a fast moving, a mix of different ways of engaging that keeps people really interested and on their toes.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's a very good question, and it's a big part of the problem.
All right. Thank you. And I think now what we're going to do is have a mingle session. And so we're going to take a few minutes, and the speakers, as well as Kathleen and I, will come down and have time to mingle with you. So feel free to click on our picture if you would like to ask us a question and have a direct conversation, or we may just pop into your group and have a conversation with you. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and especially our speakers for taking the time to talk with everyone. As we wrap up, if anyone has any type of innovation that they're doing on campus, or anything that they would like to share, or a final question that they have to ask, please feel free to raise your hand and come up on stage, or put it in the chat box. And we did want to remind you that Wednesday, November 8th will be our next session, and that will be at the same time, 12 p.m. Eastern Time. And that one will be on institutional practices with Dr. Nancy Shapiro, Dr. Renata Tall, and Dr. Letitia Thomas, as well as a guest from Cornell. We're just waiting for final confirmation for that person. So does anyone else have any questions or comments or anything that they would like to share? Again, please raise your hand or put something in the chat box. And we would love for you to continue the conversation. So we encourage you to tweet away at #STEMStudentsThrive. And we would love your feedback. We'd love to hear how this session went. If you have suggestions for, things that might make it a better experience for you, please definitely share those with us as well. And if there are no final questions or comments, I would also like to thank Chris Downs for helping us out and Shindig for allowing us to use the platform. And I'll just wait a minute to see if there are any questions, and then Kathleen will come up on stage to say a little goodbye as well.
I just want to please join me in thanking all of our speakers, Lynn, Julia, Elizabeth, and Richard, for sharing their time and their expertise. We did want to thank Shindig for hosting this facilitation and this online conversation. And we also want to thank our production team consisting of Becky Burke, Mary Hennessy, and Danica Fisher for their contributions in support of this series. And we'd also want to thank you for joining us today. Patrice?
And before we sign off, if you had a great time, please tell your colleagues, friends, whoever you might think is interested to join us on November 8th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So until next time.